I've been asked to speak briefly about how I became interested in Shakespeare, about what Shakespeare means to me, and about why Shakespeare matters. It is a tall order for 5 to 10 minutes, but I never shy away from a good challenge, especially one where I can make good trouble and generate what I, a Shakespeare and critical race studies scholar, define in my pedagogical practice as productive discomfort, a teaching philosophy that signals my rejection of the notion that there are safe spaces. As every Shakespeare play makes clear, from Titus Andronicus to Twelfth Night, there are no safe spaces. Not in the fictional worlds Shakespeare left behind for us to mine, and certainly not in the real world we occupy presently. Again, there are no safe spaces if we are being honest with ourselves. From my teenage years, around the year 1999, when I was about 14 years old, and I'm 41 now, I recall a specific moment from a high school English class session that I've never forgotten. My teacher, Mrs. Robbins Wicker, taught us Shakespeare's great tragedy, Macbeth, and she slowed down and seemingly became spellbound by Lady Macbeth's famous "out damned spot" speech. I can still hear Mrs. Wicker's words. They live within the book and volume of my brain, because my adolescent self was a little stunned that my teacher paused on a moment that required her to swear. It required her to say a bad word, one that she said with such fervor. In that moment, Zwicker, like a Broadway actress performing her best for her audience, truly embodied Shakespeare's words, and my little boyish self became mesmerized, largely because in her repeated recitation of Lady Macbeth's lines, my teacher had repeated a few times a so-called bad word, a word among many words that my parents taught me not to say. And now that I think about it, my parents telling me not to say certain swear words might be the very reason I then sprinkled them throughout my Cambridge University Press book, Shakespeare's White Others. Because if true, I guess that makes me a bit rebellious, doesn't it? You see, Mrs. Wicker's remarkably unforgettable "out damned spot" lesson, a lesson that emphasized Lady Macbeth's guilt and her complicity in the murder of King Duncan, showed me how Shakespeare's language could be surprising. Fast forward to my college years, to my emerging adulthood years, and I experienced another moment of surprise when my former undergraduate Shakespeare professor, Milla Cozart-Riggio, who is here today, introduced me to the Bard's first tragedy, Titus Andronicus, which we saw together last night at the Swan Theater. Like Mrs. Wicker and her Macbeth lesson, Riggio slowed down on a pivotal moment in Act 4, Scene 2, where Aaron, a black Moor, chooses to defend vehemently his illegitimate newborn son's life and racial blackness. To the white characters who wish for Aaron to kill his firstborn son and heir as a way to mask the Roman empress's infidelity, Aaron proudly states, "Coal black is better than another hue, in that it scorns to bear another hue. For all the water in the ocean can never turn the swan's black legs to white, although she laved them hourly at the flood." I couldn't believe my eyes when I first read those words. And I most certainly could not believe my ears when in class, Riggio referred to Aaron's speech as a kind of early modern black is beautiful moment. That articulation greatly surprised me because I, the lone black student in Riggio's course, became uncomfortable, but in such a productive way that ultimately made me feel like I mattered in Shakespeare somehow, and that there might be many ways I matter in Shakespeare, ways for me to see myself. Act 4, Scene 2 in Titus became a critical access point for me. Shakespeare's revenge tragedy, my favorite, transformed into a training ground where I battled and overcame my fear of Shakespeare. And the rest is history, as the saying goes. Here I am. You see, without people, Shakespeare means nothing to me. He cannot mean anything to me without people, and I mean that. For without people like Zwicker and Riggio and John Michael Archer, my former PhD advisor at NYU, without my parents even, and they are also here today, I would not know Shakespeare at all. Without knowing Shakespeare, I know I would be missing out on all the lessons one can glean from what the author-activist James Baldwin refers to as Shakespeare's great, vast gallery of people. Shakespeare's people, all his characters, are pedagogical tools that can teach us so much about life and even about ourselves. Thus, when I drop into a dramatic landscape, as I like to think of the process, I expect to learn and to feel uncomfortable in the learning process. As I evolve and grow intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally, I also expect my ignorance, my assumptions, my biases, my beliefs, and my misunderstandings of Shakespeare's world and our own world to be challenged. I expect the same for you too. If that reductive discomfort is not being generated for me or for you, that means I may not be ready to learn and receive the lessons, as I initially was not, even with Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Within Shakespeare's great, vast gallery of people, there are myriad lessons waiting to be embraced, internalized, and implemented. The learned lessons and the yet-to-be-discovered lessons are the reason I revisit Shakespeare's plays year after year, and not just when I teach his plays or see them performed. Shakespeare and his work matter today still, because as some people have suggested, and I'm thinking about scholars like Audreta Thompson and Richard Levin, and theater practitioners like Yael Farber and Ruth Negga, Shakespeare was ahead of his time. That sentiment resonates with me, of course, but it no longer interests me the same way that it used to, because I am now of the mind that if history truly does repeat itself, as the saying goes, then it is possible to see Shakespeare may very well be ahead of our time, too. I believe that. Given this belief of mine, I think what people sometimes deem historical repetition is one explanation for why so many folks around the world have returned over the centuries to the playwright's literature, reading it, teaching it, reviewing it, staging it, celebrating it. Because to look backward is to look forward, and to look forward is to perceive glimpses of a welded together past future in which I fear we seem stuck, living through our present moment that in the United States today, for example, recalls a history play such as Shakespeare's Richard III, which centers authoritarianism and political corruption, and even recalls a play like Twelfth Night in which, for poor Malvolio, nothing that is so, given how his dramatic counterparts deploy what they call sportful malice to deceive and abuse him. Such contemporary connections to the literature cause me to return to Shakespeare when history repeats itself. I return so I can attempt to make a little more sense of the world than I could the last time I returned to Shakespeare. As my late grandmother, Christine Wright, once said to me, if you can keep people ignorant, you can keep them under control. I could not agree more with my grandmother, Christine, who was born in 1935 in segregated Jim Crow, Mississippi in the United States. Shakespeare may have created some ignorant characters, such as Iago, who is racist, sexist, ageist, and misogynistic. But Shakespeare himself was not ignorant. We know this from the vastness of his vocabulary and invented phrases, and from the brilliance of his many plays. We also know Shakespeare was not ignorant or interested in being ignorant or perpetuating ignorance, too. He could only write about ignorance well if he understood it. For the ignorant person cannot understand the world around them because their ignorance precludes that possibility. Just as Shakespeare was interested in educating people, so am I. That is something we have in common. Therefore, I will leave you with these final thoughts. Toward the conclusion of his essay, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, which I highly recommend everyone read, James Baldwin writes, the greatest poet in the English language found his poetry where poetry is found, in the lives of the people. He could only have done this through love, by knowing, which is not the same thing as understanding, that whatever was happening to anyone was happening to him too. I could not agree more. Whatever is happening to me is happening to you. Without people, the early modern people Shakespeare encountered, his imagination would likely have been quite limited. I cannot imagine he would have written so richly about social ills like anti-Black racism, sexism, misogyny, classism, ageism, ableism, and more, without understanding that those issues were, or without understanding how to skillfully capture those issues in ways that keep us guessing what the author himself believed. His works generate a productive tension that we have to reconcile. Yet what Shakespeare himself believed is actually irrelevant to me. What is more important, what I believe everyone should think seriously about, is that Shakespeare wanted his audience, wanted us to think, presenting us with all kinds of fascinating dramatic worlds. As theater practitioner Peter Sellers suggests, Shakespeare's plays ask us to question our world. And the plays go beyond that, for they also ask us to question and then act accordingly, based on truth, based on what we believe is right. Shakespeare's works matter today because they are always asking something of us. For instance, among other things, Twelfth Night asks us to think about sportful malice and about hurting people for sport, for fun. Said another way, more specifically, Shakespeare's plays ask us to consider whether or not a racist or sexist joke is indeed a joke at all. For a joke should not be designed to harm or hurt. But that's exactly what racism, sexism, homophobia, and other isms do when masked as jokes, when masked as sportful malice. And so, I leave you with these questions. What are Shakespeare's works asking of you? And what are you going to do in response to those questions so you can make this world a better, more just, more equitable place? To be an active learner or not to be? That is the question everyone must confront when they engage with Shakespeare. Thank you.